Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. I'm Vickie Lan, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fictional trope with an eye for world building, character development, or narrative structures. If you like what you hear, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also join the conversation on Instagram or TikTok. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Okay, Crispin. If you can open up your bookstore, Stack's Book Club, in any fictional world, which would it be and why?
Oh man, I feel like I don't have a choice but to choose Wade Watts's Ready Player One world because that's where the name of the store came from.
That's true.
Um,
Yeah,
I,
tell us
I feel
about
like,
that.
yeah, I feel like thinking about like I can't imagine there is a bookstore brick and mortar style in that world at all. Like I imagine that they're all digital in that world. So the idea of putting stacks in the metaverse and recreating that sort of space in that sort of an environment, I think would be really interesting and unique.
I think that would be fun too. Now, are you thinking the reality side of Stacks, or what about the virtual reality side?
I think it would have to be the virtual reality side. I think in that society, that's the only way you operate a business. So yeah, what would it be like to travel to the metaverse and visit a bookstore where you still get all of the community and all of the interaction? I just think I've never thought about that, but that's the first thing that came to mind.
That'd be fun because people who then go to your shop might be, their avatars might look like maybe their favorite book
Maybe
characters.
their favorite book characters. Yeah, I mean, you could, yeah, it'd be so fun to see who comes to the door every day.
That would be fun. All right, Crispin. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. We've known each other several years now. You are the owner of one of my favorite, if not the best bookstore. It's definitely in this region. So tell the listeners who you are, tell them about your bookstore, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Vicky. So my name is Crispin. My wife Lizzie and I own Stacks Book Club, which is an independent bookstore and coffee bar. We're located just outside of Tucson and Oro Valley, so small, kind of growing suburb in our area. We opened the brick and mortar business in July of last year, so July of 2023. But we had been a pop-up bookstore, which is where you and I met,
Mhm.
for about 18 months before that. And so oh man, we loved so many books and so many crates and so many tables to so many farmers markets and brewery tap rooms and anywhere someone would let us put up our displays and just meet readers like yourself and try to figure out like A, do we like to buy and sell books, and B, do people buy the books that we want to sell them? And the answer was yes to both of those things. And so yeah, we opened a bookstore.
I remember on your Instagram in the earlier days when you were first developing your store idea, you were taking advice and feedback from the public. You wanted to know, what do people want out of a bookstore? And I do think you guys taking into account those opinions and having it reflected in your business model really speaks to how now you have so many people in your store for many different reasons. Can you speak to that community lens that you use?
Yeah, I think that's been really important for us from the pop-up days, even through now. We're constantly tweaking and changing what we're doing in the store. When you're planning a business, it's a plan on paper. Um, but if you're not reacting to how your customers are using your space, or what they're coming in looking for, I think you're potentially, losing an opportunity to make a connection. There's a fine balance there, right? Like we know what we want stacks to be. We know the feeling that we want you to have when you come in. And so when you walk into our bookstore, which is behind me here on video, if you're doing the video version of this, um, we don't have wall-to-wall bookcases. We have walls of bookcases, but the middle of our store is completely devoid of books, and we did that for a reason. It's more about seating. It's more about communal, coming together and sharing ideas. And the seating is sort of designed in a way that even if you come in alone, you can't really sit somewhere where you're isolated. You're gonna inevitably sit with somebody else, and you're gonna strike up a conversation because that's what was important to us when we started planning this business, which was 2020, when there were no conversations to be had with anybody. And that was what we were trying to figure out during the pop-up phase of our business journey was, do people want to look for books on shelves, or do they actually like scrolling the river? We don't say their name in our
Mhm.
household, in our
Yeah.
business. I think you know who I'm talking about.
Mhm.
And are people interested in people? And we've overwhelmingly heard yes to both of those two questions. And so our space is intentionally designed with seating. We've added a lot of seating since we opened. We reconfigured seating to make room for more people. That's a good challenge to have as a business owner. There's a limit to what we can do in that capacity. And so we try to figure out what are other ways that we can curate an experience for somebody looking to have a human to human interaction in the space that we have.
Well, not only do you have an amazing space and great events and just a feel good feeling for people that come through, you also curate a fantastic selection of books. And that is why I think you're such a great guest today on this podcast because I feel like you have a pretty good gut instinct for what does well. And so let's hear it from the bookseller's perspective. What do you look for? What do you find that your readers like? So, my first question is that authors hear a lot about what agents and publishers are looking for. But what are you looking for when you're curating books for your store?
So I think it's a delicate mix. So our store is 2,100 square feet total. That includes a full service coffee bar. Um, that's running 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., very busy almost every single day. And so our footprint for books is relatively small given the way that we operate the store. We have about 5,000 books on our shelves at any given time. That's board books through adult fiction and nonfiction. So we have to be really selective with what we bring into the store because we don't have a whole bunch of shelf space that we can have something that just kind of sits and waits. We really, and from a bookseller's perspective, we need to be moving books in and out of the store as much as we can. So we're really, really picky with what we bring in. That being said, we do try to thread that needle between what are the commercial successes, what are the things that the publishers are going to get behind, we have kickoff calls basically every quarter with all of the major publishing houses where our sales rep pitches us on, here's the 50 books at said publishing house that we're really excited about for the spring. Buy them all. We do buy some of those. We don't buy all of those because we want to make space for, I think the very first book that you and I ever talked about was a book called Kings of the Wild, which I know you actually had the author Nicholas Eames on a podcast a couple years ago. That's a book that I don't think got the fanfare and the publishing support that it probably deserved, but it's a book that I read and I loved, and I make space for that book on my shelf every single day that we are open. And so it's I think it's a balance between finding the commercially viable things that we know people are going to come in for, but then having enough things that pique your interest, um, and kind of point you in a direction of a book that you don't know about, an author you've never experienced, an author telling a story that hasn't been told enough, in our opinion at least, and making sure that we have both of those things available to potential readers when they come in. And so it's a balance, right? Like we need to sell books to stay in business. Without sales, there's no bookstore. That's sort of the truth about retail economics. But we also want our curation to really speak to what we value as individuals and booksellers. And so we have a staff of 9. We call them book tenders because they can pour lattes, but they also have a deep understanding of what we have on the books, on the bookshelves. And I think our size works to our benefit in that way too, because we have such a curated stock. Our team knows what is and isn't in the store for the most part, versus walking into, a box bookstore that has 20 times as many books as us. Those booksellers may be more attuned to selling what are the big and buzzy books as
Hmm.
opposed to, meeting the reader who wants a different experience kind of where they are.
So it sounds like what you're bringing to the table here isn't just an awareness of what publishers are pushing, but sounds like you're also a big reader and you pull from your own experiences in making those selections.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even in my reading, it's a challenge. As a bookseller, we have the opportunity to get not every book, but almost every book early. Those are mostly coming digital these days, which is challenging for someone that's not a native digital reader. But I'm adjusting. Um, and so there's a balance as a bookseller to reading ahead enough to have an idea of what's coming, what can we talk about, what can we get excited about that's coming down the pike from big publishers and from small. Um, but then finding time to go back and read the things that have come out, and have gained traction on social media or on TikTok at this point is like one of the biggest drivers of smaller imprints and indie author growth, from what we can see. And so finding time to kind of go back and catch up on some of those books. At this point, if it's more than like 2 or 3 months old, I'm not reading it. So like my ability to go back and read all of the classics that I missed is it feels basically gone at this
Mm.
point. But yeah,
Oh,
I
yeah. I
know.
feel I feel like you. I sometimes wonder how much time you have in a day to accomplish everything that you've been accomplishing. It looks like you do so much.
Yeah, audio is my friend. Thank you, Libro FM, for all of the free books that they provide us. If you're an audiobook user, I can't ask you enough on behalf of indie bookstores everywhere. Use your subscription dollars to invest in Libro FM over the other subscription model. They do such a great job supporting local independent bookstores across the country. It's amazingly how important that is to us. So yeah, I do a lot of audio. Um, Doing dishes, putting the kids to sleep, driving in the car. Like I'm constantly listening to books. That's my number one way that I consume books these days because I'm a parent of two young kids and a small business owner. And so the ability to sit down in a chair and read a book is kind of tough.
Yeah. All right, well, let's jump into the market. Let's jump into tropes. Let's get into what some of our readers are probably
Yeah.
very curious to know as they are writing their books or hopefully querying and getting their first book deals. So, when it comes to the market, do you see a shift in reader preferences based on societal trends or current events?
I do, and I think it's not a binary, right? There's readers of all different types, but I think the most common is a reader who's looking to better understand the current moment. And so those folks want books or themes that sort of speak to where we are. Um, a book like Paul Lynch's Prophet Song, um, that I think it won the Booker Prize for Fiction last year, is a book that speaks really intentionally about it's set in Ireland, but it speaks really well to where we are politically as a country today. I think there's readers who will run away from a book like that once they understand what that book is about, and there's readers that are going to flock to that book because it helps them better understand where we are. So that's like sort of like a lazy way to draw a binary between what readers are looking for. So I think there's a big group that read to escape our current world. And I think there's a big group of readers that read to better understand where we are and where we could be in the near future. And I think on both sides of that, yes, people are looking to better understand where we are today through reading, and there's people that are trying to get away from all of the trials and tribulations of daily life and kind of fall into a book that's not set here, that's not set in our world, that's not set in our time, and kind of escape into a different reality.
I remember during the pandemic, a lot of writers were trying to push new story ideas out there, during the pitch contest that used to happen on Twitter, and agents would be giving their feedback. And one of the things that agents said is during the pandemic was, we don't want to hear your pandemic stories right now. Can you please send me all of your fantasy feel good things? And part of me wonders if that's why we're now getting a bunch of like legends and lattes and, that kind of
Yeah.
lighter type of stuff.
Yeah, I feel like in general fiction, we're like in a moment of like I think the pandemic era has finally arrived. I feel like a lot of contemporary non-genre fiction at least has to mention COVID and the pandemic era in some way, to sort of like frame where their characters are. And but I feel like genre fiction still, I feel like genre fiction, especially like science fiction, was ahead of the COVID pandemic idea. Like for a long time, the idea of, post-apocalyptic, the idea of, you know, global warming and eco catastrophe, like those are things that genre fiction has been exploring for a really long time. And so I could see where those publishers in those fields at that time were looking for something different. But yeah, like Legends and Lattes, Apprentice to the Villain, some of those more like light stakes fantasy books where there's not as much world building and the stakes feel less and they're ultimately like positive stories. I think people are still looking for those too.
Are there any overused or tired tropes that you think readers are starting to move away from?
Yeah, so I pulled our staff on this question specifically, to get a sense of what is some of the other people in the Stacks universe feeling like. And so here's a list of things that, from our team's perspective, are tired and overused. The
Ooh.
number one being miscommunication. Um, so I think societally, especially male miscommunication, I think we're starting to see more people gravitate towards men who can express their emotions, as opposed to sort of like the closeted feeling. Um, so that was like the thing that came up the most. Some other ones that our team came up with was enemies to lovers. Most
Oh,
people are tired
really?
of that, and there's a on the flip side, they want more lovers to enemies,
Ooh.
as like a more interesting way to sort of like put that trope on its head. This may speak to where we are currently, but surprise pregnancy was another one that came up as a trope that people are tired of. Um, the things that they want to see more of, um, like I said, lovers to enemies, villains to heroes. So kind of taking the traditional trope and spinning it and retelling it in a new way. Faustian bargains was an interesting one. I had to actually Google
Ooh.
what that is.
Is that
So
when
that
you make a deal for something and it
exactly,
ends up
that's like
being
the Addie
worse?
LaRue style of like, I'll make a deal with you. My soul is on the line for some, some sort of opportunity, like a Rumpelstiltskin style, going way back in terms of like what that story might look like. Um, there's a comedian, if you're familiar with Pete Holmes and the You Made It Weird podcast, but about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, he coined this phrase, damsels do it them damn self.
Okay.
And that's, I think, a trope that we're seeing a lot of, especially in the fantasy genre right now. This idea of the heroine character no longer waiting to get rescued. The
Mm.
heroine, the heroine, and I think this came out in Westworld too, is like another place where I saw this trope come through. I forget the character's name, but in season one, she's like the first character that kind of like breaks free of her story, and she says I envisioned a story where I didn't have to be a damsel anymore. And so this idea that agency can be had, you can take control. And I think that's like Fourth Wing is like an example of that, I feel, with a character that maybe in a different era of fantasy was getting saved and now she's saving herself. So yeah, this idea of like damsels do it them damn self is how I like to think of it, courtesy of Pete Holmes.
I love that shift, that transition from the like the what did you say? Enemies to lovers to enemies. Didn't Lord of the Rings or the Ring of Power or something like that? I think they did that in their first
Yeah.
season, which I think is refreshing. I saw someone else also mention and I don't know what book they were referencing, but it was you think a villain is going to get a redemption arc, but it ends up in a betrayal instead.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the surprise I think readers are looking for now, and I think as writers are planning trope usage, I think that's the biggest thing is I think the tropes are good, and like the classics, the Tolkiens and the Herberts, like there's so much legacy to build upon, but like how do you as an author bring a different take on that classic trope and leave the reader with an unexpected result? I think from a dialogue era of book, which I really feel like we're in, that's where conversation comes when there's a surprise, and it's not a surprise of, ooh, the main character died. I think there needs to be more baked into there. Like I feel for a while George R. R. Martin had convinced every writer that if like your main character didn't die, there was no stakes in your book. And I don't think that has to necessarily be true, but I still feel like sometimes, especially in fantasy, we're chasing that feeling of like, if I'm not willing to kill my main character, like where are the stakes in the book? And I don't think we necessarily need that to happen all the time.
I feel like in the book industry, especially from a writer's perspective, there's this degree of almost prediction. So you're writing your book and you've chosen your choices, right? You have your plot development, your character development and structure. And then it all hinges on if you choose to go the traditional route, which will then eventually kind of get in front of the face of the bookseller. Um, an agent is looking for specific things, and it could be a reflection of the time. So just like the pandemic story, they wanted fluffier, cozy fiction. But then they're also trying to predict what's going to sell if that book gets sold like 2 years later. So what are your thoughts on that kind of prediction requirement and how predictable are these things?
I think it's interesting because I have a limited perspective, right? We operate a bookstore in a suburban community, that I think has a little bit of a different natural taste to the types of books that get read and bought in our store. I'd be interested to know if we operated a store in a more urban environment, what that mix of books would look like. And so that's been like probably one of the biggest growing items that we've learned a lot about our buyers and about our customers in the last year that we've been in business. And so the predictability from the sales reps, I think, is interesting because there's books that we get pushed as booksellers by the reps and by the publishing houses that land quite flat for us in our area. So we've sort of kind of learned a little bit about what types of books those might be and make some better bets. I think predictability is hard because where people are learning about books has changed in the last couple of years. Like I mentioned TikTok earlier, it's amazing how many people we talk to on a daily basis that say, I saw somebody on TikTok talk about this book. And the influence now that book influencers have in the marketplace
Mhm.
is so much greater than what I think we knew it to be before we started selling books in real time. I think we have the ability to influence sales in our store based on what we like and how we talk about a book through our social channels and through our interaction with customers. But I think out in the ecosystem, I think more people are finding out about books through social media than any other source right now. So I think it makes predictability hard. I think the other thing that publishers try to use is adaptation rates. Like if a book's adaptation rates are sold before the book is even published, that's like the number one thing we hear about is so and so already sold this book. It's going to be produced by this, this movie house. Like, get excited. And so there's a certain amount of predictability. Like there was the whole Argyle
Mm.
thing, or if your readers are familiar with that story. That I don't know if that was like almost a year ago now. The idea of this Ellie Conway, this unknown author that no one knew who she was, no one could find her anywhere. She wrote a book. It got picked up by in a bidding war by a publishing house. It was going to be a movie before it became a book. And then turned out it was actually a book inspired by the movie as a marketing tool to like sell the movie, uh,
Oh.
which landed a little bit flat and didn't feel all that great from our perspective because I personally got kind of stuck into the mystery too. Like, wow, this book must be so great if the film rights were purchased and the movie was expedited to, green light and production and it's in the theater and the book hasn't even come out yet. And then it turned out to be sort of like a red herring of publishing and it was actually marketing for the movie.
I'm so glad you brought up social media because that does introduce a very interesting perspective to selling and how stories get hype. So let's talk about your social media presence. Now, I think you've mentioned in newsletters, does Lizzie run the social media?
Yeah, yeah. So Lizzie does all of our social media. And she started the process of like building the community. And, before we opened our brick and mortar store, we had a couple thousand Instagram followers. We're like approaching 10,000 total social media followers now, which is kind of crazy to think about the growth that has had for us. But that's like right now our number one channel for connecting with our customer base for the most part. We send emails too, but yeah, social media we use pretty heavily to tell the story of the store, but also to kind of get people excited about the books that we're excited about.
When authors are pushing their own work, because we're all kind of playing on the same platform here, trying to get seen, authors can kind of see what their posts are reacting to. But I imagine you have a wider perspective. You posting about many of the different books that come in each week when you have new book releases. What kind of reactions do you get on social media that can kind of indicate to you, oh, this book is going to do well, or maybe this book isn't as interesting?
Yeah, so the thing that we are able to see on our end and is shares. Like when we can see a post about a book or like we just posted that we're going to do a midnight release for the new Rebecca Yarros Onyx Storm in January. And so when we make a post like that, we can start to see that share metric grow and grow and grow and grow. And to
Mhm.
us, that is the number one indicator that a book is going to be popular or an event. If we're running a bookish event in the store and we start to see, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of people sharing that piece of content, that's usually a pretty good indicator to us. People are really interested in this book. We get like a baseline number of likes on every post that we put up for the most part. Like we'll have certain posts that garner more or less, but it's really for us, it's the share metric that will tell us people are excited about this because that takes a little bit more of a investment to see something click twice instead of clicking once.
Okay. Well, and speaking of all these new ways to get attention on books, I'm noticing a trend where lots of books are getting the sprayed edges treatment. Tell me, tell me about that.
um, they're a blessing and a curse, I feel. I feel like the sprayed edges are the new like judge a book by a cover.
Hmm.
Like how intricate, how detailed are the sprayed edges? I think it definitely is helping people buy more books. We definitely order more books that are going to come in deluxe sprayed edition than books that don't.
Hmm.
It's definitely like a very successful selling mechanism. From a bookseller perspective, um, it's a real challenge because in shipping, some number of books get damaged in shipping all the time, right? Like we have a process with all of our distributors where a book comes in and the cover's mangled and what we send that book back, we get a new one. Whatever the sprayed edges are like a unique challenge because it's paint and paint can be scratched. And so if we're gearing up for a major midnight release party, which is another super fun thing I didn't think we were ever going to do, but we have so much fun doing now. And some number of books come in and they've had their sprayed edges damaged in shipping. That creates like a whole new level of like panic on our end. So they're great. I mean, yeah, it's a huge emerging trend. We're seeing deluxe reprints as another growing thing. Like we're seeing more and more deluxe reprint edition that have sprayed edges and additional content and sort of like a repackaging of a story that's already done really well. You mentioned Legends and Lattes. There's special editions of Legends and Lattes in books and bookshops and Bone Dust. So if you wanted that in hardcover, it's coming. Emily Henry just published a deluxe special edition of Beach Read. TJ Klune just came out with a deluxe reprint of Cerulean Sea with sprayed edges. And so those are other trends that we are seeing in the publishing space, sort of a previously successful book being repackaged and resold for the new audience. From a collector's perspective, I think it does a couple things. If you didn't get House in the Cerulean Sea in hardcover when it first came out, but you want to buy Somewhere Beyond the Sea in hardcover, most collectors want their sets to be the same.
Hmm.
And so doing the reprint gives the collector an opportunity to now have a hardcover and a hardcover that are the same size and the same dimensions. And then they kind of curate their collection that way.
All right. Well, I have listeners that are both traditionally published and that are either or and traditionally published or independently published. So let's talk about your relationship as a bookseller with authors. So what is your relationship with the smaller indie presses or just the independent authors?
So it's growing. I think that's the biggest thing. And we're trying to kind of figure out what the right balance for us is. We don't only want to stock books from the big houses. We want to make sure that we are canvassing as many different types of stories and types of authors and as we can. Um, I think sometimes indie can mean not yet traditionally published. I look at somebody like Lila Sage that started as an indie author, sort of like bet on herself, turned that into a multi-book deal with Dial Press, and now she's kind of on like a different trajectory.
Hmm.
Um, so we try not to place value in where that book is being published as we like assess that book. The true reality from our perspective as like one small store is it's hard to find time to give all of the stories the time that they deserve and need in order to find a place on our shelf. That's kind of like just a number one, the like most simple way. We try to be very open with our local authors. Here in our community, we have a dedicated section for local authors, which I'm like really on the fence about whether that's the right way to showcase and treat a quote unquote local author. I feel like in my mind, putting a local author on a local author shelf is inherently saying this author's not worthy of being in the mystery section or in the thriller section because they're on the local shelf. But then I also want to make sure they don't get lost on that shelf. And we kind of do highlight like this is somebody in our community whose book you can pick up and read and support. And so like as a bookseller, I'm like constantly going back and forth on, am I honoring that author and that book's opportunity to find a reader or am I doing them a disservice by categorizing them as a local
Mm.
author? So like that's like maybe inherent to me. And if somebody has an opinion out there, I'd love to hear like as a local author, as an indie author, like where do you want your book put on the shelf? Um, we're doing an event with a relatively small publishing house that you're actually going to be hosting in a couple weeks. So we are finding more and more ways to partner with publishers of all size to bring authors into the store. I think that's a thing that we find to be super valuable and super engaging is getting authors into our store to meet and talk to readers. And we do that with, we've had authors on national book tours where we're the first or the last or one of several stops that include LA and New York and Chicago. And we're excited that's starting to happen for us more. But we also like to showcase authors who aren't on those tours. So the first Friday of every month, we now host two authors in our store, give a platform for them to be able to talk about their writing, talk about their process, showcase their books. We also do a local author fair twice a year that's really popular. The truth is, for indie authors, like I think we're up to like 40 submissions for our local author fair that's going to be in November. We can take 8,
Ooh.
maybe 10. And so it's a challenge because we know we want to provide the support, but we're limited in terms of space, in terms of like what we can do to do that. So I don't know if that answers the question, but we want to be doing as much as we can to help independently published and smaller publishing houses find readers because I don't think that there's a necessarily a quality difference per se. Sometimes it's just a book hasn't found the right buyer to showcase it to booksellers like myself. And so we don't want to discount a story just because it comes from a different source,
Mhm.
but we're also limited in what we can do.
And I know you've already mentioned that you were very pressed for time. So if I imagine this question could be a little difficult to answer, but from a writer's perspective, when you go pick either path, I usually see the debate centering around how much creative freedoms you have as a writer. So if you choose a traditional route, you are basically subjecting your story to the agent's edit list and then ultimately the editor's edit list before it finally gets published. Whereas indie, it's depending on exactly what you go for, there's a lot more freedom. So as a result, do you see the indie author kind of challenging the norms of tropes and genre fiction and introducing new ideas compared to traditional?
I'd say yes and no, and I think kind of back to our previous conversation about tropes. I think it's the indie authors that can take a classic trope and make it into something slightly different or something unexpected that really get that traction. I think there's something to be said about creating like a wow moment with the reader that creates the unexpected surprise that gets people wanting to share that experience. And I think we are in an era of sharing the reading experience being really important to growing as an indie author. So like the more and but like but doing it in an authentic way, right? Like I think about Lila Sage again. I think she uses a lot of classic romance tropes, but she does it with neurodiverse characters. She does it with characters who have different body types than what like traditionally published romance novels have characters. And so she's been able to connect with readers on a more like real level, I guess, like making more readers feel seen. And so then they want to share that with somebody else. And I think that's sort of the key is figuring out, and it's everyone wants to go viral, right? Like if
Mm.
going viral was easy, everybody would do it. Like, so like how do you package that secret sauce? No one actually knows, except for maybe Mr. Beast. Um,
You just
but
gotta give everyone money every time you
yeah, right.
post.
Just slip $100 bill on each one of your books, and I'm sure it will sell great.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, I think, I think indie authors have more ability to color outside the lines, but then it's a matter of how do you connect that book to readers in a way where they get to experience that, and then how do readers help you as the author grow the buzz about that book that I have less insight into, but that's what I see in indie books that turn into commercial successes. there's some amount of online buzz that develops around that book that people are really into.
Sometimes that buzz, while could be responding to a well-loved trope in addition to like new and surprising
Mhm.
ideas.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit because this relates a little bit to my next question. But moving out of just the realm of indie and now looking at all authors and all writers at various points in their career, what advice would you give to them so that they can use tropes effectively in their storytelling? I feel like you kind of already answered this, but
Yeah,
pulling back
I
a bit.
think yeah, I think anytime any artistic endeavor, I think authenticity is always key. And I think from a business owner, I think that's something that we strive for too. I think our customers connect with our store because I think we do a great job of being authentic and communicating in a way that we sort of let customers know what's important and valuable to us. And I think as a reader, I want to know that the story is rooted. It doesn't have to be autobiographical, but there needs to be something about that story that is inherent to that author. And I feel like commercially, I think there's some authors that start that way, and then commercial success and publishing pressure, I feel like can lead to something else along the way. I feel like I see that most in like second novel dip, where like an author will spend 11 years writing their first novel, and it's been so poured into, and it's been so edited and curated and planned, and like everything in there is so intentional, and it's a huge success. And then the second novel comes out 9 months later,
Hmm.
and it leaves you feeling like, oh, this feels like this was rushed to make sure that the buzz of the first book helped sell the second book. And I feel like that happens a lot with second novels specifically. And so I think what readers are looking for is that authenticity. And I think everybody has a story to tell that they can tell. And it's how do you tell that story, but then how do you communicate to the reader that the story you wrote was written by you because only you could write it?
Hmm.
Uh, and I think readers want to know. I think they want to know more about that author, and they want to feel like they have a sense of like this author gets me because they created this character that was for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because that actually validates a lot of what's been going through my own head as so my book is currently on submission. It's in editor inboxes right now. And I've been thinking a lot about what my next steps are. And one of the thoughts in my head is it worth doing a multi-book deal if it means having to write your next book in less than a year? And I worry about that. But then I have dozens of ideas, and every time I finish workshopping them, I go, but this could this have come from someone else? Like, what is it about like me that's in there? And so for me now, it's about finding the next story that kind of speaks from my own heart. And maybe I'm doing too much, but it just feels right from my perspective. So it's nice to hear you say that.
Yeah, I think authenticity in the writing is so important. I think if the book has heart and soul, I think readers can see that. I think they can feel it. I think it helps them connect to the book in a way that, some authors are going to be commercially successful all the time because they've been commercially successful for so long. Um, but I think the books that we like to talk about as booksellers are the books that we can feel the author in that book.
All right. So how can writers get more involved with you in your programs?
Yeah, so we have a series of workshops planned for NaNoWriMo coming up in November. So we're excited to get more introduce like more active in that space and more active in bringing writers into our space and bringing authors in all various stages of the writing process and the publishing world to just kind of be there to help in whatever way they can. We're kind of looking at it as like office hours with our author in resident for that evening.
Mhm.
Um, you know, getting to know us, I think, like this is specifically for Stag's Book Club. Get to know us as much as you can. Like we're just like anybody else. The more we get emotionally invested in what you as a human is doing, the more likely we are going to be to want to invest in your book when and if it's indie published traditionally, goes to a major publishing house, whatever it is. So like from our perspective, like let's get to know each other. That's what an independent bookstore should be about. Should be about us knowing you, you knowing us. You get us emotionally hooked. We're gonna go to bat for you, 100%. you know. So, you know, I think that's huge. I think stopping in, dropping off a book is a good first start. Um, Stopping in and asking us every couple weeks, "Hey, did you read my book yet?" I think it's a little bit more challenging.
Mhm.
We want to read every book that we get. We can't always, but the deeper our relationship grows, just as people, the more likely we are as booksellers to get behind your project. Just being totally candid.
And you definitely provide tons of opportunities for people to come in. You have events pretty much at least every weekend.
Yeah, we have events every we try to have events every weekend of all size and scope. That are book related and non-book related. My goal is that if you're not a reader now, you're going to come into Stacks, you're going to grab a cup of coffee, you're going to grab a beer, you're going to grab a wine, you're going to take part in a spelling bee, you're going to do a trivia night, and eventually I'm going to get you. You're going to find something on one of our shelves that's going to pique your interest, and as soon as you read that first page, you're a reader. And that's how we look at it. We try not to define a reader as somebody who reads a certain number of books or a certain type of book or a certain format of book or even a book in general. We look at it like if you are reading something that adds value to your life, you are a reader, and we want more of those in our community, however we can get them.
Thanks so much for joining me, Crispin. Do you have any final words?
No, I'm really excited to see your book when it comes out in whatever format it comes out. I've been tracking your journey for a while, and appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with your audience today. Support your local indie bookstore. Um, I can't tell you how much we all appreciate the patronage and the support for local books.
Well, thank you, Crispin. All right, and readers, thank you for listening in, and we'll be back next week with a new episode. Bye.